So what I wanted to do today, seen as there were, quite a few really interesting sounding individual contributions on the program about the visual culture of medicine, broadly construed, was to offer a fairly general overview of some of the trends in the historiography of medicine and its images, and to just develop a bit of a sort of panoramic view of the field. I think that's quite a sort of an interesting. I mean, it's a really interesting field. Obviously, I mean, I'm biased, but it's also one which has been part and parcel of the history of medicine from the very beginning. There's been a wide range of questions and approaches developed in historical studies of medical images, started by doctors themselves, who created the first historical accounts of the discipline, as well as its images. And if we look at early examples, they frequently served as celebrations of medical achievements, or they presented historical curiosities to fellow medics. And a good early example of this is Joseph Hirtel's Antiquitates Anatomicae Rariores, published in 1835. And that's really something of a grab bag of historical goodies. And among other things, it charts the earliest attempts to visualize the interior of the body from prehistory to ancient Rome. It also describes some Chinese anatomical figures, and includes a chapter on anatomy culinaris, culinary anatomy, which I'm not going to go into detail so shortly after breakfast. More important, perhaps, among the really early contributions is a more systematic and really quite ambitious early study, which provided important impulses for research. And that's a publication by Ludwig Schuland from 1852, with the rather long and descriptive title, History and Bibliography of Anatomic Illustration in its relation to anatomic science and the graphic arts. And you can access both the German original and an early translation online. It's been fully digitized. So Schuland was a physician as well as a medical historian, and his history provides a brief account of anatomical illustrations, both medical and artistic, from antiquity to his present, i.e. the sort of earlier 19th century, followed by detailed analysis of individual anatomists and their key publications. And in some ways, his work really shaped the agenda of historical scholarship on medical images. So, for instance, Schuland already drew attention to the really important role of artists and artisans, not just the medical experts themselves. He also tried to develop a broader analytical framework, as well as value judgments concerning the scientific accuracy and artistic merit of different works. In particular, what he did was he proposed a classification of anatomical illustrations into three broad categories. The first, schematic representations; the second, exact depictions of a particular subject; and finally, images of what he called the ideal human type, which should be based on the synthesis of multiple observations. And Schuland suggested that just the latter really was suitable for teaching purposes, and required not just numerous observations based on dissection, but also what he called an ardent artistic vision, which would amalgamate specific observations into this composite image of the ideal type. Schuland also proposed a chronology which divided the development of anatomical images into 6 distinct periods, distinguished by a number of different criteria. So including, for instance, images' artistic, aesthetic characteristics, methods, their purposes, but also, for instance, the relationship between artists and anatomists and the way it changed over time. So his first period, for instance, he suggested was characterized by schematic drawings in the Middle Ages before Berengario da Carpi. And he ends with modern times, i.e. for him, the early 19th century, since Samuel Thomas von Sömmering. And this is a period that he defined by a combination of what he saw as anatomical truth and aesthetic beauty, but also by the adoption of new technologies, such as lithography and steel engraving, as well as the creation of new histologic and microscopic representations, which took anatomy beyond the limitations of the naked eye. So that, for him, is what characterizes the visual culture of the modern medicine of his day. Overall, Schuland's study highlighted a wide range of issues which would become important for future scholarship on the visual culture of medicine. I've already mentioned the contribution of artists and artisans, as well as their collaborative, more or less collaborative and harmonious relationship with medical professionals, the impact of new techniques and technologies, but also he already paid attention to things like the role of pricing and marketing for the distribution and readership of illustrated publications, as well as the interactions between European imaging traditions and those of the Islamic world and of China. So in the wake of Schuland's pioneering study, subsequent historical scholarship of the late 19th and early 20th century provided increasingly detailed documentation of existing images and traced their transmissions across space and time. Typical here are, for instance, the works of Karl Sudhoff, including a study on the tradition and observation of nature in illustrations of medical manuscripts and incunabula of the 15th century, and one on contributions to the history of anatomy in the Middle Ages. More recent research has developed a wider range of thematic foci, from the politics of medical images to the historical epistemology of representation, the relationship between different visual traditions across the globe, and images' multiple uses as instruments of identity formation and boundary work relating to issues such as race, gender, and professionalization. And I'm going to present a few examples of those works in the coming section. So the post-war period saw a rise in historical studies of medical images by academic historians, as well as medical professionals. Now, these scholars generally turned away from evaluating the representational accuracy of historical images by modern standards. The social and cultural history of medicine that emerged since around the 1970s rejected some older traditions which focused on the lives and ideas of great men, and developed new directions of research on topics such as, for instance, the role of the patient in the medical encounter. Think, for instance, of the work of Roy Porter, the development of medicine as a profession pioneered, for instance, by Toby Gelfand, and the ways in which the very experience of the body and of illness changed over time. Think, for instance, of the work of Barbara Duden. Now, medicine from this perspective was more than a progressive accumulation of ever more accurate knowledge of the human body and of ever more powerful techniques and technologies of imaging and healing. Instead, it was embroiled in and inseparable from its political, cultural, and social context. Historians highlighted how medical ideas and practices were used to develop, justify, and implement political agendas, from welfare policies to the support of imperial rule and eugenics, for instance. And anatomy in particular was reevaluated by social and cultural historians as a discipline whose practices, images, and concepts were deeply enmeshed in political action and ideology. For instance, just to name one example, political power, class, and poverty were key to debates about access to bodies for dissection, as well as the dreaded practice of illegal body snatching, as vividly documented by Ruth Richardson, for instance. Since the 1980s, historians of medicine increasingly engaged with new approaches to cultural history, which broadened their attention beyond elite cultural forms, as well as with the work of Michel Foucault, which drew attention to the politics of images by framing modern medicine as a quintessentially visual discipline and tying vision to new forms of knowledge and new forms of power. Scholars interested in the visual culture of medicine challenged simplistic concepts of representational realism, showing that concepts and conventions of what counts as realism and what counts as objectivity are always historically contingent. We can think here, for instance, of the work of Sander Gilman, Ludmila Jordanova, Dustin and Gallison, some of which I will return to in a minute. At present, research informed by feminist and post-colonial approaches continues to highlight how images of the body are inseparable from their political and social context. As a result, interpretations of medical images, more specifically, adopted a more explicit political focus, one which investigated the role of images for articulating concepts of gender, sexuality, race, and the normal. And in the following, I'll offer a few examples, and you can see some here on the slide. Just to give a few notes on gender, Caroline Merchant's influential study, The Death of Nature, Women, Ecology, and the Scientific Revolution, which was published in 1980, put forward a very strong argument that the subjugation of women and the exploitation of the environment were at the core of the birth of modern science. She suggested in her provocation that gender inequality was supported by and expressed through anatomical images. And a number of influential case studies have developed this argument further since the 1980s with detailed analysis of specific anatomical representations. So for instance, Londa Schiebinger's studies of Enlightenment anatomy argued that the decline of the traditional humoral concept of the body, which had located fundamental differences between men and women in their humoral constitution, prompted scientists to search for physical signs of difference between the sexes in their anatomy instead, and especially in the skeleton. Such efforts, Schiebinger claimed, had to be understood within the context of contemporary attempts to redefine women's place in society more generally. If the new political philosophy of John Locke and his contemporaries aimed to develop an optimal social order on the basis of an appeal to nature and natural laws, then the continuing inequality of the sexes and the exclusion of women from civil rights had to be justified by natural inequalities. And according to Schiebinger, by the 18th century, anatomists paid close attention to anatomical signs of sexual difference. Samuel Thomas Sömmering, for instance, claimed to have achieved the representation of the typical female skeleton, while Marie Thiroux d'Arconville suggested that women had smaller skulls and a larger pelvis than men, confirming in her mind their intellectual inferiority and their natural destination for childbirth and motherhood. Now, subsequent studies, such as, for instance, the work of Michael Stolberg, have challenged Schiebinger's chronology, but her argument has given crucial impulses to the historiography of medicine and its images. Similarly influential was Ludmila Jordanova's sexual visions. She documented how 18th century anatomical wax models presented images of men and women in strikingly different ways, showing male bodies in active poses, muscular and upright, while female bodies were frequently depicted in repose, passive, and usually with a focus on pregnancy and the organs of reproduction. Now you can see an example here on the right of the slide. This is a wax male anatomical figure from the 18th century, now in the Science Museum in London, but attributed to Clemente Susini, a wax modeler from the Great Modeling Workshop in Florence. And you'll see some examples of reclining females on one of my later slides. Now, Jordanova argued that such images both expressed and reinforced contemporary gender roles. And in another one of her case studies, she looks at William Hunter's Anatomy of the Human Gravid Uterus, exhibited in figures, of which you can see just one image here on the left. This was often cited as a benchmark publication due to the high quality of its large-scale images. And in it, Hunter made aesthetic choices which separated the mother from the development of the fetus by reducing the female body to the gravid torso, devoid of head and limbs, truncated, as you can see here, by raw cuts that enacted the violence of dissection. And there are many subsequent studies of anatomical images in this tradition that have highlighted the influence of gendered stereotypes continuing up to the present. And also showing that this was not restricted to the medium of drawings, prints, and models. Medical photography, for instance, a technology which was often presented as objective and untainted by observers' subjective perceptions, was never detached from the aesthetic and cultural conventions of their time. For instance, those of contemporary portraiture and the tradition of the freak show. Photography, for instance, was used to make the mother invisible once more in 20th century images of the embryo, where it's depicted as sort of free-floating, detached from the mother's body, which nourished and protected it. And indeed, attempts to identify visual markers of gender difference have also been traced down to the level of microscopic anatomy, for instance, with early 20th century attempts to provide incontrovertible visual proof of individuals' so-called true sexual identities in the face of complex and temporarily fluid sexual characteristics at the macroscopic level, as Ilana Löwy has shown. Many scholars have pointed out, for instance, Londa Schiebinger, Donna Haraway, etc., that the oppression of women was frequently justified by comparing their supposedly inferior anatomy to that of children and racialized others. In the 19th century, such assertions were framed within the context of evolutionary theories, and women were sometimes considered to represent a less than fully developed human body, a more primitive stage in human evolution than the white male. And this is where I want to turn to race as a marker of difference that became another key category for the historiography of medical images. So scholars have documented how Western medicine justified the violence of slavery and colonialism by postulating the existence of racial difference and of a racial hierarchy which placed whites at the pinnacle of humanity. Medical research became central to arguing that racial difference was deeply embedded in the fabric of the body. And again, the visual plays a huge role in this. As in the case of gender difference, the skeleton became a central focus for locating racial difference in the 18th century. The so-called Age of Enlightenment saw the adoption of things like cranial angles as markers to create racial hierarchy. One example we've got here is by the Dutch physician Petrus Kamper, who used measurements of skulls to define races. And he used illustrations to reify not just racial difference, but also something that could be read as a hierarchy, suggesting that European cranial structure was closest to what he considered the ideal type of classical sculpture, while African and Asian skulls in his series were put closer to the cranial angles of apes. Race in this tradition became a pervasive but unstable category, and researchers developed a range of different and potentially and often conflicting taxonomies. Now, a third area of demarcation through visualization that I'd like to sketch out is that of normality and productivity. Medical images could be used also to draw boundaries which did not directly invoke categories of gender and race. In recent decades, historians have analyzed the use of images to chart the development of two central concepts applied to human bodies and human identities, the monstrous and the normal. Studies of medieval and early modern science in particular have traced the evolution of European conceptions of monsters. Originally seen as evidence of divine playfulness and divine signs, this perspective gave way to an increasingly developmental understanding, which ultimately interpreted the monstrous body as a disrupted and defective deviation from normal human development. Critical studies of medicine and modernity have identified the concept of the normal as central to the definition of the modern body. Emerging in the 19th century, the homme normal, the normal man of Quetelet and other early statisticians, was initially purely a statistically defined entity. However, historians have documented an increasing slippage between the original statistical definition, on the one hand, and attempts at visualization, on the other hand, which were increasingly applied to individual bodies and used in a normative rather than a descriptive fashion. Images were key to this process of re-articulating the concept of the normal body from a statistical and descriptive concept to one that was individualized and normative. Such images could be used to support particular public health measures, as well as, for instance, to promote specific beauty ideals, but also collected in archives to generate an image of society and be used as the basis for social policy. One example here is from Birgit Nemetz's recent work on interwar Vienna, where she looked at the work of philosopher and sociologist Otto Neurath, who propagated the so-called Viennese method of pictorial statistics, the Wiener Methode der Bildstatistik, which he considered, in his words, a new proletarian style of schematic representations of anatomy, physiology, and health more generally, which was designed to convey new anti-bourgeois visions of communal urban living and society more generally. In the age of industrialization, the early modern exhortation to know thyself was increasingly replaced by an ideology of individual responsibility for the maintenance of a healthy and therefore productive body. This development was accompanied and supported by the recurring use of the image of the body as a machine. This way of making the workings of the body intelligible had a long tradition, of course. You know, for instance, that Leonardo da Vinci had used simplified mechanical drawings in his anatomical studies to understand the mechanics of motion. Early modern philosophers and physicians, from Descartes to de la Mettrie, had used the machine metaphor to assess the relationship between mind and body. Ingenious artisans like Jacques Vaucanson materialized this idea in the form of animated automata, such as the flute player and the defecating duck. In the 19th and 20th century, however, this vision of the body as machine was used to create the concept of what Mike Sacco has called a specifically industrial body. And this industrial anatomy found its expression in images such as the one you can see on the slide on the right, Fritz Kahn's Man as Industrial Palace, Der Mensch als Industriepalast of 1926, which depicted the body as a factory and its physiology as a series of carefully directed and supervised mechanical and chemical processes. Now, in the next section, I would like to move on to artists and anatomists. Beyond the politics of medical images, scholars have turned their attention to questions of style and iconography. So a number of earlier analyses in art history, for instance, compared the depiction of bodies in fine art and in anatomy, highlighting stylistic and technical parallels, such as, for instance, the resonances that some art historians have seen between Bernini's peacefully ecstatic Saint Teresa on the left, with female wax anatomies of the 18th century, such as Susini's anatomical Venus whom you can see here on the right. This is an example which is now in the Josephinum collection in Vienna. And there is a well-established line of scholarship that continues to explore the boundaries of art and anatomy, with a focus on representational styles, conventions, and materials, as well as the role of anatomy in fine art. And we could go here all the way from the early work by Julius Schlosser, for instance, from 1911, to the work of, for instance, Anthea Cullen, Georges Didier Übermann, Martin Kemp, and others. Other scholars have turned their attention from the style, iconography, and content of images to their production. And here we can, take this back all the way to Schulland's lead by looking at the collaboration between medics and artists, which wasn't always particularly harmonious. And there's a particular interest among historians in the potential for tensions when it came to claims of expertise. In other words, who's more important, the artist or the anatomist? Now, already in 1945, the influential medical historian Henry Siegerist acknowledged that, in his words, the many illustrators, known and unknown, have in all probability contributed infinitely more to medical science than we commonly assume. But not all anatomists have been happy to acknowledge that as well. More recently, historians have connected studies of anatomical representations to questions about the nature of expertise, therefore. What was more important for the creation of useful and accurate anatomical images, anatomical knowledge, or artistic skills? Whose expertise was considered crucial for the creation of accurate anatomical representations? And I think one thing that's really interesting about recent developments is that studies have started to challenge and to complicate established narratives about the role of medical representation for demarcations of gender and race, and vice versa. So, for instance, Lucia da Come's investigation of the practices of the female anatomical wax modeler Anna Morandi in Bologna in the 18th century showed how Morandi's claims to expertise were actually inextricably tied to her femininity. You can see her self-portrait here on the left as she is daintily dissecting a brain while wearing her Sunday best, as well as an example of her work with the anatomy, a study of the anatomy of the hands. And what Morandi did, and da Come has shown this, is she basically used her identity as a woman precisely to strengthen her anatomical authority, rather than saying that women are intellectually inferior and therefore less likely to produce authoritative anatomical images. Morandi claimed that motherhood had made her experience the malleability and the formation of the human body in the most intimate way possible, and in a way that no male modeler would be able to surpass. So she explicitly used that to argue for her expertise. More generally, the practical production and circulation of medical images continues to be a fruitful avenue for historical research. So Nick Hopwood, for instance, has drawn attention to aspects such as the role of three-dimensional embryo models as what he calls publications, items which actually shaped the boundaries of the new discipline of embryology and helped support its disciplinary status in this period. Similarly, for the early modern period, there's a very interesting recent project of a census of Vesalius's iconic De Fabrica by Daniel Magoshi, Mark Somos, and Stephen Joffe. And they trace in this project the book's long history as a commercial object, as a teaching tool, and as a collector's item through the centuries. And it's in these studies that medical images emerge from such analysis as dynamic and historically contingent, rather than the creation of permanent static representations. The turn to practice has also unearthed the role of contributors to the production and maintenance of medical representations whose labor has frequently been erased from public memory. while individual medical professionals, or more rarely artists, claimed authorship of medical images, most production processes required a much higher level of collaboration, as well as contributions of those who, for instance, procured the bodies and body parts, those who preserved and prepared them, artists and artisans, patients and live models, among others. The relationship between these contributors was often complex and shaped the image's claims to objectivity. Artists and anatomists engaged in extensive debates about the perceived tension between the anatomist's quest for accuracy of representation and the artist's desire to achieve elegance of form, as the anatomist and educator John Bell put it. And here's one such example. In public, this is a very schematic setup of the production process at the wax model workshop of the Museo La Specola in Florence in the 18th century. And you can just see some of the players here in public. The late 18th century natural philosopher Felice Fontana, who directed the production of anatomical wax models for the Florentine Museum, played down the role of artists and others in the process of image making. He presented his artists as, in his words, mere tools in the hands of the learned anatomist. And yet there is this really complex network of artists, anatomists, scientists, craftsmen, seamstresses, carpenters, administrators, modelers, members of the public, etc., all of whom contributed to the process. And some of these contributions have been acknowledged publicly, and others have been minimized. And there's a whole politics about whose expertise counts behind this process. And this is something which we can see in many really key medical works that use illustrations or models. So, for instance, Henry Gray of Gray's Anatomy deliberately minimized the contribution of artist Henry Carter, despite the fact that Carter himself was a professor of anatomy in his own right. More rarely, we see the reverse maneuver. For instance, Jean Cruvellier, the French anatomist, when he marketed one of his illustrated publications, went to great lengths to praise the brilliant talent of his artist Antoine Chazal, with whom he collaborated, because for him this was a key sort of marketing feature of his work. Now, with this, I want to think a little more about the epistemology of images and their use in education. And again, there's just a few examples here. So, in other words, having talked about who is considered sufficiently expert to make authoritative images, the question then is, how do they actually work? The search for authoritative medical images revolve broadly around two core questions. What is an appropriate subject for depiction, and how should it be depicted? So Nancy Siraisi has shown, for instance, that already in the Renaissance, scholars debated whether average bodies should be chosen for dissection, which in that particular context seemed to mean male and middle-aged bodies. Or whether anatomists should instead strive to observe as wide a range of body types as possible. This question of human anatomical diversity was raised in particular in one of the most influential works of anatomical description and illustration, Vesalius's De Fabrica, which combined anatomical illustration with textual descriptions of the human body. And critics of Vesalius highlighted this inherent tension in his approach. If, on the one hand, dissection demonstrated the individuality of human bodies, no two bodies are alike, then how could idealized images stand in for them? Indeed, it wasn't always obvious what images represented and what function they performed in medical education. As Sachiko Kusakawa has shown, for instance, the representational strategies used by Vesalius required a wider rethinking of the role of anatomical images for medical teaching and medical research. What is their status as evidence or as a teaching tool? What can and what can't images do? what should be the relationship between bodies, images, and words. For Vesalius, ultimately, images were central to the construction of what Kusukawa has called specifically visual arguments, which treated anatomical images like geometrical diagrams, which would allow readers to actually draw general conclusions concerning questions such as the best location of cuts for bloodletting. Now, historians of medicine and of science have frequently used medical images and the debates surrounding them as key examples for claims about the historical epistemology of images more generally. So they've taken medicine and especially anatomy as a test case. For instance, in Daston and Gallison's influential study Objectivity of 2007, they used the genre of the anatomical atlas as a case study for their argument that techniques of production and the subjectivity of image makers were actually inseparable from claims about the accuracy and utility of images. They also used anatomical atlases and other such works to show how concepts of objectivity changed over time. And they famously developed a broad classification of what they considered different epistemic virtues. So on the one hand, the so-called sort of truth to nature, which was based on the selection of ideal types, mechanical objectivity, which resorted to the use of automatic devices, and trained judgment, which emphasized the importance of education for the creation of expertise in pattern recognition. A key example here for mechanical objectivity, for instance, the sigmometer on the right, with an example of the automatic recording of pulse patterns, ostensibly thereby bypassing the subjective perception and judgment of the observer. Now, historians have qualified Daston and Gallison's chronology, but their definition of these three distinctive conceptions of objectivity has been widely adopted as a useful shorthand for different understandings of the function of images. Now, this epistemology of images has been shown to be inseparable from questions about how medical knowledge was made and used in practice. Recent scholarship has been interested in the role of users, and especially users' hands-on interactions with images, as well as the role of multimediality, the combination of different media. One example includes, for instance, the peculiar genre of flap anatomies, fugitive sheets, paper bodies constructed from layers of movable parts, which afforded a sense of a depth and three-dimensionality to the user. Just one example here on the left, and I've got another example coming up on a later slide. Such flap anatomies were first created by early modern printers, both for scholarly books and as more widely affordable single sheets, but you can see examples of this going all the way up to the 20th century. New technologies continue to shape medical images beyond the advent of the printing press. And of course, one key example is the introduction of photography, as well as improvements in microscopy, such as the development of achromatic lenses, which challenged medical researchers to reflect once more on the epistemology and utility of images. How reliable or useful were representations produced with the help of such new technologies? And I think one thing that's really interesting is that technological innovation often heightened rather than solved conceptual and practical problems. 19th century practitioners, for instance, came to the conclusion that photography often had little value for morbid anatomy, as it offered a sort of chaotic wealth of detail rather than a clear and instructive representation of key features that would be useful to students. Pioneers of forensic science who tried to locate criminality and degeneration, both in the individual and in the social body, grappled with the apparent contradiction that photography, in the words of Alan Sikula, defined both the typology and the contingent instance of deviance in social pathology. Often presented by its 19th century advocates as a prime example of mechanical objectivity, photography did not resolve long-standing questions about the role of subjectivity judgment, and cognitive authority in visual representation. As Natasha Ruiz-Gomez has shown, for instance, medical innovators such as the neurologist Jean-Marie Charcot actually preferred to use a combination of old and new representational techniques to compensate the respective shortcomings of both. And that was quite a common move. Now we've already started to talk about users, and again, that is a very lively area of medical historical scholarship at present, especially when it comes to the uses of images and objects. And one thing that this research shows is that medical images and medical displays have served many different purposes beyond medical research and teaching. For instance, representations of the body were frequently used to simultaneously instill in their audiences, for instance, a veneration of divine creation. They were used to act as tools for moral instructions and as opportunities for reflection and the creation of deeper knowledge of the self. The Greek motto, know thyself, was first used with reference to anatomy when it was adopted as a motto on those 16th century anatomical sheets as well as textbooks, and widely cited by anatomists. Early modern publications combined such anatomical representations with the aesthetic conventions of the danse macabre, creating images which invited the observer not only to develop a better understanding of the structure of the human body, but also to reflect on the fragility of human life and the contrast between the mortal body and the immortal soul. Public dissections performed in early modern Europe were similarly multifunctional, as were anatomical miniatures produced in wood and ivory. This interpretation of anatomical displays beyond strictly medical uses continued to shape audiences' responses well into the modern era. For instance, if we look at 18th century attempts by reformers to educate medical lay people and to emancipate them as they saw it from superstition and quackery, they created frequently very visually appealing displays of anatomical images and models lacking the stench of the corpse itself, which were deemed more suitable to encourage engagement and learning. And yet, if we look at audience responses to those displays of anatomical waxes, we find that they often respond in ways much more in tune with earlier traditions as opportunities for pious reflection and moral improvement. And indeed, the close relationship between anatomy and morality expressed through images and models continued in the 19th and 20th centuries. So for instance, you've got your gruesomely accurate depictions of syphilitic lesions that warned young men of the dangers of promiscuity in the 19th century. Public health campaigners using medical images to highlight the agency and responsibility of the individual to maintain their bodies in good health, productivity, and reproductivity. And to the present day, we see some anatomical displays aimed at lay audiences really exploiting the continuing ambiguities of such representations. Body Worlds, for instance, a globally successful show of plastinated bodies and body parts, advertises itself as educational, with a rhetoric not dissimilar to the rhetoric of 18th and 19th century reformers. However, the body's appeal to audiences does go beyond the educational. Body World's invocation of what they call the fascination of the real ostensibly serves to convey anatomical knowledge to lay audiences, and yet things like the side-by-side display of the smoker's blackened lung next to the healthy organ plays with titillation and disgust. So that raises the question, how effective were anatomical images at conveying their intended messages? Historians have highlighted the role of such images for popularizing specific changing ideas about health. And in the modern period in particular, as mentioned, such images often implied a large degree of control over the body, as well as a person's individual responsibility for maintaining good health. The reception responses to medical images frequently poses methodological challenges for the historians. Evidence of responses and uses tends to be less well documented than the programmatic and prescriptive texts which often accompanied such images. The intended take-home message is often clearly articulated. What audiences actually made of these displays has to be found in letters, diaries, possibly newspaper articles, etc. And indeed, the right response to medical images is often a really interesting feature of demarcation as well, because it was often the proper use of images and the use of proper images that was used to demarcate experts from lay people. And with this, I want to think a little bit about the politics of class and formation of professional identity. Again, something that historians have a long-standing interest in is the politics of class and its intersection with the formation of professional medical identities. Portraits of the medical profession posing with, for instance, the open corpse or with a collection of specimens and images have long been used to articulate claims to medical expertise. And here's just a few of the most famous examples, whether it's Vesalius's portrait at the center of his programmatic frontispiece to De Fabrica on the right, Rembrandt's anatomy lesson of Dr. Taube on the left, or Joshua Reynolds's portrait of John Hunter at the center, accompanied by his books and specimens. However, the long-standing association of dissection with corporeal and capital punishment in Europe meant that, not surprisingly, there was widespread reluctance to offer one's own body or those of loved ones for dissection. And this opened up a very rich seam of visual material. Anatomy became increasingly central to medical education, and you can see that in images from the 18th century, such as this, of dissections taking place in an attic. And at the same time, while dissection becomes so important for medical education, the popular perception of dissection as dehumanizing and shameful often resulted in shortages of human material, which in turn gave rise to the insalubrious practice of body snatching. And here just a few of the many sort of images that came out of that debate. A portrait of John Knox, including sort of perhaps less than flattering image of him in action dissecting a pig in the lecture room. You've got the famous Hogarth series, The Four Stages of Cruelty, which culminates in the dissection of the body of the villainous Tom Nero as the final punishment for all his evil deeds in life. And countless caricatures involving body snatching, such as this one, the anatomist overtaken by the watch. Protest and resistance against body snatching and against legal measures to make the bodies of the unclaimed poor available to medical schools produced such rich visual artifacts, caricatures of body snatchers and anatomists, but also, for instance, the rather unique object known as Jeremy Bentham's auto-icon, as the utilitarian philosopher requested the preservation of his body after death to encourage wider acceptance of dissection. Such practices and representations shaped the identities of those whose bodies were instrumentalized, but also those who were involved in image production and use. And this was seen very clearly by contemporaries. Practices of making and using images became central to the professional formation of medical students, practitioners, and researchers. Medical teachers, such as the celebrated William Hunter, operated on the assumption that dissection would imbue students, in his famous expression, with the necessary inhumanity required of medical practitioners. Overall, the medical schools of the late 18th and 19th centuries employed corpses, specimens, models, prints, and drawings to facilitate an emotionally detached interaction with the body, which was considered central to professional identity and discipline formation. The introduction of new imaging technologies further supported this distancing development. The late 19th century saw the development of dissection photographs, which staged groups of students and teachers around a corpse on the dissection table. These images were often accompanied by bleakly humorous or straightforwardly brutal sayings. For instance, "She lived for others but died for us." They also represented the vast power imbalance and social gulf between medics and their so-called human material. In the United States in particular, the dissected were not only poor, but often Black, surrounded in the photograph by groups of white men in middle-class clothing. Such staged images strengthen group identity among medical students, while making other actors invisible once more, especially the technicians and janitors who were responsible for the dirty work of corpse procurement and disposal, as Warner and Edmondson have documented in their work on dissection photographs in the United States. Now, as we're nearly at the end, I just want to turn very briefly towards some engagement with art and anatomy in the present. What we see is that artists and scholars continue to draw on medical images for more creative explorations of the human condition. Modern imaging techniques have contributed to new ways of representing the human body in art and literature, for instance. And in recent decades, growing interest has also led to a re-evaluation of medical representations by art historians such as Mechthild Fend and Natasha Ruiz Gomez, as well as to new forms of engagement by fine artists and by curators and gallerists with historical and contemporary medical images and models of the body. We can see, for instance, growing engagement with the conventions, materials, and techniques of medical representations by artists such as Damien Hirst and Mark Quinn, who have contributed to the rehabilitation of materials and genres formerly deemed vulgar, including, for instance, wax modeling and wet preparations. Influential exhibitions exploring the intersection between art and anatomy both expressed and reinforced artists' and audiences' interests in representations of the body and their history. And here's just a couple of examples. Next on the left, you see one of Damien Hirst's monumental anatomical models. On the bottom left, you've got Mark Quinn's self-portrait in blood. And then on the right-hand side, you've got 4 examples of exhibition projects, The Quick and the Dead and Spectacular Bodies, both at the Hayward Gallery. You've got The Sacred Made Real at the National Gallery London, and for instance, Die große Illusion on veristic sculpture, which was at Liebighaus, Frankfurt. Now, beyond fine art and established museums and galleries, there's been a resurgence of anatomy as spectacle presented in a variety of formats. A reinvention of the Cabinet of Curiosities and the Freak Show for audiences both live and online. Once again, in these displays, anatomical representations such as the plastinated smoker's lung displayed in body worlds are presented and perceived in different ways, whether as reminders of mortality, as appeals to personal agency and responsibility, as opportunities for voyeurism, or as occasions to empathize with past sufferers. And the ethics of such displays are currently a very live issue with public institutions. I would only point you, for instance, to the decision of the Hunterian Museum in London not to display Charles Byrne, the so-called Irish giant, anymore in their recent redevelopment of their displays, as well as an ongoing debate at the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia about an intended collections review that reconsiders some of the human material on display. And I think that's a very real issue that is very salient for us as historians of medicine as well. And I think we have to be quite careful in thinking about what visual material we present in our presentations and in our work as well. So, for instance, I've made a deliberate decision today to minimize the use of actual human remains in my slides. Now, with this, I would like to end the slides and just finish by wrapping up. So hopefully this very quick run through the history of medicine has shown how historians have engaged with the role of visual culture since its inception. It's responded to ideas and approaches from a wide range of disciplines, from art history, social and cultural history, to feminist and post-colonial studies. And these analyses have engaged with long-standing debates among medical practitioners about what medical images actually show, how they should be produced, and what they can and can't be used for. Attention to the historical specificity of artistic styles and conventions highlights that such images never are unmediated representations of an objective universal truth, but fundamentally shaped by the social, political, and cultural contexts of their time. Images, in turn, have shaped human activity and the very definition of humanity itself. They've been used to justify the subjugation of women and racialized groups, to support public health measures, to assign or deny agency and responsibility for health. Medical representations have also played a central role for the expressions of professional status and symbols of authority. They could also be used in the process of medical socialization for medical students. More recently, scholars have also begun to read medical images against the grain and with a focus on conflict, subversion, and resistance. Attention to the process of image making and to the role of artisans and others reveals struggles for authority and authorship, as well as challenges to traditional gendered and racialized claims to superior understanding. The recent historiographical focus on practices, audiences, and use, for instance, shows that the function of medical images is never completely determined by their design, and that users demonstrate interpretive flexibility, which could ignore, challenge, or subvert intended messages and uses. Thank you.